Hello, this is Julian with Coffee Reviews, and today we'll be reviewing the Kapsokisio wash processed Kenya from Tim Wendelboe. And there's the bag right there. And Tim Wendelboe, based out of Oslo, Norway. And they're a coffee roaster that's appeared on this channel on multiple occasions, including recently when we reviewed the Kapsokisio Pacamara, and I actually purchased this coffee alongside that one, after having a discussion with my good buddy Connor on which Kenyan coffee to purchase, as it was between this one and the other Kenyan coffee that Tim Wendelboe was offering at the time. And while the other one did sound a little bit more like my type of coffee, Connor was actually a pretty big fan of this one, so we decided to purchase it based off of his recommendation, and it'll be interesting to see how it turned out, as this right here is day 39. And recipe we went with for this coffee was once again Tim Wendelboe's recipe, which is a 15.38 to 1 water to coffee ratio, brewed at 99 degrees Celsius, about 210 degrees Fahrenheit, and actually preferred this one through the Chemex, which does indicate a more medium grind. Now, roast profile for this coffee, as we've alluded to in the past, Tim Wendelboe is one of the lightest roasting coffee roasters in all of Europe, and this one definitely holds true to that as well, as this is a very light coffee by most standards and metrics. It actually did feel a little bit lighter than that Kapsokisio Pacamara as well, which is to say this is a very light coffee. With all of that out of the way, let's go ahead and start discussing this coffee. Day 14, first impression, and we opted for the V60, and interestingly enough, this coffee had a nice candied aspect to it, as it was a little bit more moderate and well-rounded than perhaps initially expected with the red floral forward profile. That was definitely something I expected going into it, as it offered plenty of the herbality and a decent bit of sweetness, with the listed hibiscus feeling like a very apt descriptor for this one, as this had a very well-defined hibiscus-like component to it that I've experienced from so many coffees, so very much in line with the expectations, if anything maybe a little bit more candied than I might have expected. Day 17 opted for the Chemex, and a lot of the expected Kenyan brightness is at the forefront, with plenty of the herbality and savoriness that's expected from Tim Wendelboe's coffees as well, specifically the Kenyan coffees. A long-lasting, lingering herbal florality to the cup, with an intense red-based focus, slight tart berry aspects to it as well. Basically, the descriptors I have so far to this moment are some very Kenyan forward components to it. Day 20 opted for the April brewer, and the cup continues to remain pretty consistent, as it's offering more of the anticipated Kenyan profile in abundance, with red forward characteristics ranging from the tart berries to the floral herbality, with plenty of the brighter aspects to it as well. I want to say that there's nothing overly unique or distinct as of this moment. It's basically a lot of what you might expect given the profile of this coffee, given the roaster, and given exactly what this coffee is. Day 23 opted for the V60 with Tim Wendelboe's recipe, and this is the most vibrant the coffee had been up to this point, with an abundance of those vintage Kenyan characteristics, offering a bright red fruit, red floral forward cup with a slight bit of savoriness. So this is the first time I've taken note of that savory aspect to it. It does play a role in it. It's probably something you're going to be expecting from this coffee, but here we're noticing it at the most abundant point it's been. Day 26 opted for the Chemex with Tim Wendelboe's recipe, and this is the best the coffee's been up to this point, and that was a little bit of a theme of what was to come from this one going forward, as it had more of the candied sweet aspects to those tart berries. A bit of the tart aspects with plenty of the Kenyan characteristics, most specifically the brightness, very much present, but the cup continues to remain mostly consistent and straightforward. Nothing too unique or distinct about this. Honestly, just a little bit more vibrancy and a little bit more of that candied aspect is what helped set this day apart from previous days. Day 29 opted for the V60, and the cup continues to remain pretty consistent, as there's an abundance of those classic Kenyan bright characteristics at the forefront, with a slight herbal and savory aspect at the back end. Not overly sweet, but rather focused a bit more on the brightness, which once again, I think that's probably much more what this coffee was going for as opposed to the sweetness, so nothing too much to add on that day. Day 32, back through the Chemex with Tim Wendelboe's recipe, and this is the best the coffee's been up to this point, and that's why I opted to make the tasting wheel on this day, and mostly it's because there was plenty of definition to the cup, but it's the epitome of what you'd expect from this coffee. This is a Tim Wendelboe coffee. This is a Kenyan coffee, and it's offering an abundance of red characteristics to it, and that's exactly what I'm experiencing. It's been pretty consistent, but the biggest takeaway and most notable thing I had from this day is that it's actually remaining on the cleaner side of things. There's a slight bit of that savoriness, however, I think there's enough definition in the rest of the cup to justify that part of it, as it continues to remain super red forward, but the emphasis remains on the herbal red florality of this one, very much in line with that listed hibiscus aspect. Day 35, final notes we have. One more try through the V60, and the cup does feel like it's continued to improve with time. So here we are, day 39, and this one's with the Chemex, and I still feel like the best of this coffee might be yet to come, as it's improving ever so slightly, but with each brew it does appear to be going up a little bit more. There's more of the candied aspect in this cup yet again. Most prominent, most pronounced it's been through the V60, with a continued emphasis on the classic Kenyan red berry and herbal floral aspects. All right, let's go ahead and put up the tasting wheel so you can see what we're getting. And we have a lot of level 4s. So let's start with the body, and we're going to skip the cleanliness, but we'll start with the body first. Level 4, yes. And that is kind of interesting to it, as this one was brewed with the Chemex. And here, as I'm drinking on day 39, I feel like maybe that might have been a little generous. However, I think that there might have been enough texture to justify it being on the slightly higher side of that mark. I did make the tasting wheel side by side as I made it with the Caballero Pacamara, and I think it had enough of the body on those 2 days to justify it. If anything though, it is maybe on the slightly lower side of level 4, but it definitely still has a fair bit of texture and body to it in general. Finish, level 4. Yes, don't think I have too much to add to that. Very much what you're going to expect from a Kenyan coffee. As I've always said, it'd be extremely surprising if a Kenyan coffee didn't at least score that level 4 mark. Plenty of those bright, lingering red aspects to this cup. Acidity, level 4. Again, another part of this tasting wheel that isn't a surprise to anybody, as this one offered plenty of classic Kenyan brightness to it. Don't really have too much to add to that. Can't go any higher. Even with some higher temperatures, this one still seems to have plenty of that brightness in general, so level 4 does feel perfectly fitting for this one. Florality, level 4. Yes, and I do believe that in addition to the hibiscus, they might have had something along the lines of like maybe a rose hip. I'm not entirely sure what the other note they had on here was, but nonetheless, this is a very red forward, red themed cup of coffee, and the floral aspects of it can be seen in multiple levels, but they're all going to be this red floral component to it. Most pronounced characteristic, most consistent characteristic. Interestingly, I'd say it was even more pronounced in the red berry aspects, which also did score that level 4, and that part in no sense is surprising, as it had an abundance of classic Kenyan tart berry components to it, that of course insinuating those currants, as well as just some more tart berries in general, so not surprising there. And then we're going to circle back to the cleanliness level 4. And it's something I'd kind of mentioned on the day 32 note, where I said this coffee has tremendous definition to it, so it does have the savoriness. You're seeing that scoring there at that level 3, as it does have a fair bit of those kind of savory Kenyan characteristics to it. I don't want to necessarily say tomato, because it's not an overly tomato forward coffee. Rather, the berry aspect of it just does have a little savory aspect to it. So it did score level 3, and I've said in the past that if a coffee was scoring at that level 3 savoriness, it was very hard to justify the cleanliness being the level 4. But this one right here had such great definition in the other parts of this coffee, most specifically thinking of the florality, and then once again the berry aspects to it, that I felt it would have been a little bit of an injustice to score it at that level 3 mark. So maybe a little generous for how I typically score Kenyan coffees, but a level 4 does seem pretty fitting for this one for me. Then we have a couple of level 3s. We'll start with the sweetness level 3. Yes, and once again, I don't think that this coffee is necessarily meant to be the sweetest coffee in general. I feel like this one's more meant to accentuate a lot of the Kenyan characteristics. Given that at times I was experiencing a very nice candied aspect to it, that's more of a testament to Tim Wendelboe, as I feel like they do one of the best jobs of maybe getting some more sweetness and candied aspects out of luring roasted coffees. Citrus fruit. Level 3, yes, that one might actually be a little generous, but oftentimes when it comes to these slightly tart aspects to it, I can experience them alongside of a citric component, though I don't necessarily feel like there's tremendous definition or something specific in terms of that citric direction. I can feel a slight bit of a citric component to it, if maybe a little undefined. And then one other thing I actually wanted to discuss real briefly was the stone fruit, which scored at that level 2. There's a really nice peachy aspect to this one. It's buried underneath all of these classic Kenyan characteristics to it, but whenever I'm able to pull that out from a Kenyan coffee, it's something that I enjoy very much from them. And I feel like that might be an underrated component and an underrated part of this coffee. As I took that sip right before discussing the tasting wheel, I experienced it. I'm like, this is really nice about this coffee. Probably my favorite part. If maybe I could have experienced it in more abundance, then I would have enjoyed this coffee even more than I did. But that's just something I wanted to discuss real quick. As I'm looking back at this tasting wheel though, I do think it's a pretty accurate representation of what I was getting from this coffee. All right, so my overall thoughts and impressions of this coffee. Once again, Tim Wendelboe is kind of offering a coffee that seems to cater a little bit more towards their own preferences as opposed to mine, which is fine. I had a pretty good idea of what to expect from this coffee going into it, and I have to say that this might have been about as close to the expectation I had for a coffee as it turned out to be, if maybe slightly better, because I don't want to downplay some of the really positive aspects of this, most specifically the clarity. Tremendous definition to this coffee, so I wanted to give Tim Wendelboe credit for that. And while this coffee is a little bit more on the traditional classic Kenyan side of things, most specifically with that strong red forward aspect to it, the red berries, the red florals, as well as a fair bit of that savoriness and brightness, that's typically not my type of Kenyan coffee, but I feel like given that this isn't necessarily my type of Kenyan coffee to begin with, it's a pretty nice version of it, and it's something that I enjoyed throughout, and I feel like this coffee is still going to improve with a little bit more time. Type of person I would suggest this coffee to, this is about as straightforward and easy of a recommend suggestion as I might possibly have. Your classic lighter profiled Kenyan coffee drinker, because this has all of the components that you're hoping for and expecting in something like this, as it does offer some above average clarity, massive credit to them on that, some floral aspects, most specifically in that red direction, plenty of those classic Kenyan tart berry aspects to it, and then plenty of brightness as well, with some added bonuses, including a slight candied aspect, as well as that ever so subtle peach component to it. And while it may not necessarily be the sweetest coffee or Kenyan coffee that we've reviewed, it still does offer enough of those other characteristics and traits to make up for that by offering a very classic Kenyan profiled coffee. I think for the most part, that's the best way I can leave this review. If you by chance had an opportunity to try this coffee, I'd love to know your thoughts and impressions of it as well. If you're enjoying the content, give this video a like, subscribe if you're not already subscribed. But this right here has been a review of the Kapsokisio wash processed Kenya from Tim Wendelboe. Thank you for watching.